Dawn breaks over the Valley of Sedan on September 1st, 1870. Napoleon III, nephew of the great Bonaparte and ruler of France for 2 decades, finds himself trapped with 120,000 of his soldiers. They are hemmed in on three sides by an enemy they had not expected to face with such overwhelming force. Above them on the ridges and hills, over 400 Prussian guns are aimed down into the valley, and when those guns open fire at sunrise, they will not stop until an empire falls. By the end of this day, Napoleon will surrender his sword, over 100,000 French soldiers will become prisoners, and the course of European history will change forever. To understand how an emperor ended up trapped in a valley with nowhere to run, we must go back to the France he ruled. In 1870, France appeared to be the most powerful nation in Europe. Paris was the cultural capital of the world, host to grand exhibitions and architectural marvels. The French army had a reputation forged over centuries, from the Revolutionary Wars to Napoleon Bonaparte's conquest of Europe. The tricolor flag flew over territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. France seemed untouchable, but appearances can be deceiving. Napoleon III, born Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, had come to power in 1848, riding a wave of nostalgia for his uncle's glory. He was elected president, then staged a coup in 1851 and crowned himself emperor. For 2 decades, he played the game of European politics, supporting Italian unification against Austria, sending troops to prop up a puppet emperor in Mexico, hosting lavish state events to project French prestige. But every one of those moves had failed or backfired. The Mexican adventure ended in disaster when Maximilian, the emperor France installed, was executed by firing squad in 1867. French troops retreated in humiliation, the intervention having drained the treasury and killed thousands for nothing. At home, political factions tore at each other. Republicans wanted to abolish the empire entirely, monarchists wanted a Bourbon restoration, and even loyal Bonapartists were losing faith. Napoleon III's support depended on one thing: delivering victories. By 1870, he could barely deliver himself. The emperor was 62 years old and dying slowly. Bladder stones caused him constant, agonizing pain. He couldn't sit comfortably, couldn't ride for long, and relied on opiates just to get through the day. They left him foggy and slow. His face, once animated and expressive, had become a wax mask of exhaustion. Aides noticed he walked carefully, as if every step hurt. But he was a Bonaparte, and that name came with expectations. His uncle had dominated Europe, crushed coalitions, crowned himself in Notre Dame, and made kings tremble. Napoleon III couldn't escape that shadow. To be a Bonaparte meant winning wars, making Europe bend to French will, and never showing weakness. The problem was that France wasn't ready for the war his name demanded. The French military looked impressive on parade. Officers wore magnificent uniforms and carried proud family names, sons and grandsons of men who'd fought at Austerlitz and Jena. The soldiers were considered among the finest in Europe, hardened by campaigns in the Crimea, Italy, Algeria, and Mexico. France possessed the chassepot rifle, a breech-loading weapon superior in range and rate of fire to anything the Prussians carried. But logistics were a disaster. The French army hadn't fought a major European war since the Crimea in the 1850s, and the lessons from that campaign had been ignored or forgotten. Equipment was scattered across depots with no central inventory. Mobilization plans existed on paper, but had never been tested. When the call came to assemble the Army of the Rhine, the system collapsed immediately. Units couldn't find their artillery arrived without shells, cavalry had no horses, supply wagons didn't show up, and maps were outdated or wrong. One general would later say his army lacked everything except courage, and that courage, it turned out, wasn't nearly enough. While France drifted on inertia and imperial nostalgia across the Rhine, a very different kind of leader was at work. Otto von Bismarck was not a soldier, but a Junker, a Prussian landowner who'd entered politics and discovered he had a genius for it. He was tall, heavy-set, with a booming voice and a mind like a chess player's. Bismarck understood something fundamental. Wars were not about glory or honor. They were tools to be used when diplomacy couldn't get you what you needed. And what Bismarck needed was a unified Germany under Prussian control. He'd been working toward that goal for a decade with surgical precision. In 1864, he maneuvered Prussia and Austria into a joint war against Denmark over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Prussia won and gained territory, but more importantly, it tested the reformed Prussian military and found it worked beautifully. In 1866, Bismarck turned on Austria itself. The war lasted 7 weeks. The Prussian army, using railroads to mobilize faster than anyone thought possible, equipped with breech-loading needle guns and directed by a professional general staff, smashed the Austrian forces at Königgrätz. Austria was expelled from German affairs, and the northern German states fell into Prussia's orbit, bound together in the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. But the South remained independent. Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and Hesse-Darmstadt were proud, Catholic, and deeply suspicious of Protestant Prussian domination. They had signed military alliances with Prussia, but resisted political unification. Bismarck knew he couldn't force them. He needed something else, an external threat. He needed the southern states to fight alongside Prussia against a common enemy so powerful and dangerous that unification would seem not like submission, but survival. He needed France. More specifically, he needed France to start a war that looked like French aggression. If France appeared to be the attacker, the southern states would honor their alliances, fight beside Prussia, and in the heat of shared victory, accept a unified German empire. The question was how to make France take the bait. The spark came from Spain. In 1868, Spain had overthrown Queen Isabella II and was searching for a replacement monarch. The Spanish government approached Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a distant cousin of the Prussian king, and offered him the throne. Leopold wasn't particularly important, just a minor German prince with no real power, but his family name was Hohenzollern, the same family that ruled Prussia. For France, this was unacceptable. If a Hohenzollern sat on the throne in Madrid and another ruled in Berlin, France would be surrounded on 2 fronts, bringing back memories of the 16th century when Habsburg emperors had encircled France from Spain and Austria simultaneously. When news of Leopold's candidacy reached Paris in early July 1870, the reaction was immediate and furious. The French government, led by Foreign Minister the Duke of Gramont, sent sharp diplomatic protests to Prussia. Gramont stood before the French legislature and publicly declared that France would never tolerate a Hohenzollern on the Spanish throne. It was a direct challenge spoken openly in front of the world. Bismarck, watching from Berlin, knew he had to be careful. If Prussia appeared too aggressive, the southern German states might hesitate to support a war. He needed France to look like the bully, so he did nothing. King Wilhelm I of Prussia, who was vacationing at the spa town of Ems, also wanted no part of the crisis. When the French protests grew louder, he privately advised Leopold to withdraw. On July 12, 1870, Leopold withdrew his candidacy. The crisis was over. France had won. But Gramont wasn't satisfied with victory. He wanted humiliation. Driven by pressure from Napoleon III, the Bonapartist government, and his own arrogance, Gramont sent new instructions to the French ambassador in Prussia, Count Benedetti. France didn't just want Leopold to withdraw. It wanted a guarantee in writing that no Hohenzollern prince would ever accept the Spanish throne, not now, not in the future, not under any circumstances. On the morning of July 13, 1870, Benedetti approached King Wilhelm during his daily walk through the gardens at Ems. The king was in civilian clothes, taking the waters for his health. Benedetti, in full diplomatic formality, presented France's demand. Wilhelm listened politely, then declined. He told Benedetti that Leopold had already withdrawn and that he, the king, had nothing more to add. He would not give a permanent guarantee. The conversation was cordial, with no insults and no raised voices. Wilhelm wished Benedetti well and continued his walk. The king's aide sent a telegram to Bismarck in Berlin summarizing the encounter. The message was dry and factual. The ambassador had made a request, the king had politely refused, and there was nothing further to discuss. When that telegram reached Bismarck, he was having dinner with 2 of his closest allies, General Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the Prussian General Staff, and General Albrecht von Roon, the war minister. Both men were frustrated, believing war with France was inevitable and that Prussia should fight it now, while the military advantage was clear. Bismarck read the telegram, then read it again, and then he saw the opportunity. He picked up a pen and began editing. He cut out the polite phrasing, removed the context, shortened sentences, and sharpened the tone. When he finished, the revised telegram made it sound like King Wilhelm had dismissed Benedetti with contempt and that Benedetti had insulted the king in return. Bismarck looked up at Moltke and Roon and asked how this version struck them. Moltke read it and smiled, saying it sounded like a slap in the face. "Good," Bismarck said, "because that's exactly what Paris needs to hear." He released the edited telegram to the press. Newspapers across Europe printed it the next morning. In Paris, the reaction was explosive. French newspapers screamed about Prussian arrogance. Headlines declared that King Wilhelm had insulted France's ambassador and dishonored the nation, and crowds poured into the streets chanting, "A Berlin! A Berlin!" Opposition politicians who had spent months criticizing Napoleon III suddenly rallied around the flag. The Chamber of Deputies erupted in demands for military action. War fever gripped the capital. Men lined up outside recruitment offices, bands played patriotic songs in the boulevards, and cafes filled with talk of marching to the Rhine, humbling Prussia, and dictating terms in Berlin within weeks. Napoleon III, sick and exhausted, understood the trap but couldn't escape it. His government needed a victory to survive. The press was howling for war, and the public demanded satisfaction. If he backed down now, he'd look weak, and weakness meant revolution. Revolution meant the end of the Bonaparte dynasty. On July 15th, the French cabinet voted for war. On July 19th, 1870, France formally declared war on Prussia. Bismarck had exactly what he needed. France had declared war first. France looked like the aggressor. And the southern German states immediately honored their military alliances with Prussia. It wouldn't be Prussia against France. It would be a united Germany. In Paris, confidence ran sky high. French military officers toasted the coming campaign. Soldiers boarded trains singing, convinced the Chassepot rifle would cut down Prussian infantry and French courage would break German discipline. This would be a short war, everyone said. 6 weeks, maybe 8, then a triumphant return and French dominance restored. In Berlin, Moltke and the Prussian general staff activated mobilization plans they'd been refining for years. Telegrams went out to every garrison, every depot, every railroad hub. Within hours, trains began moving. Regiments assembled at predetermined stations. Artillery batteries rolled onto flat cars. Supply wagons were loaded with food, ammunition, and medical supplies, and cavalry units rode toward concentration points along the frontier. It was a machine that had been tested, refined, and calibrated, and now it was in motion. France had no idea what was about to hit them. Within 2 weeks, over 400,000 Prussian and Allied German troops would be concentrated along the French border, organized into 3 complete armies with clear objectives, supply lines, and coordination. France, meanwhile, was about to discover that declaring war and actually fighting one were 2 very different things. The French High Command had a plan on paper called the Army of the Rhine, which was supposed to concentrate near Metz and Strasbourg, then drive east into southern Germany. The goal was to split the German states apart before they could unite, knock Bavaria and the smaller southern states out of the war, and force Prussia to negotiate. It was a good plan that might even have worked, but it required an army that could actually mobilize, and France didn't have one. The French military had no centralized staff system like Prussia's. There was no single organization coordinating rail movement, supply distribution, or unit assembly. Instead, individual commanders were responsible for gathering their own forces and moving them toward the frontier, and the result was pandemonium. Regiments arrived at assembly points and found no artillery. Artillery batteries showed up and discovered they had no shells. Cavalry regiments arrived without mounts because the horses had been sent to the wrong depot, and supply wagons that were supposed to carry food and ammunition never showed up. Maps were outdated, officer rosters were wrong, ammunition was incompatible with guns, and medical supplies were missing. One general sent a frantic telegram to Paris. "I have infantry but no artillery, artillery but no horses, cavalry but no carbines. Send everything immediately." The reply came back. "Utilize local resources, advance as planned." There were no local resources, and there was no plan anymore. Marshal Achille Bazaine, who was supposed to command the offensive into Germany, assembled what forces he could around Metz, gathering around 170,000 men, the core of France's professional army. But they were scattered across fortifications with no clear objective. The offensive into Germany never materialized because there were no supplies for it, no coordination, and no realistic chance of success. Instead, Bazaine waited. Further south, Marshal Patrice de MacMahon tried to assemble another force near Strasbourg. He scraped together around 45,000 men, but they were a mix of line regiments, reservists, and garrison troops who'd never trained together, and his supplies situation was equally dire. Emperor Napoleon III, arriving at the frontier in late July, found not an army ready to march on Berlin, but a disorganized collection of units strung out along the border with no coherent plan and no way to feed themselves for more than a few days. He reportedly wept when he saw the state of his forces. The German armies, meanwhile, didn't wait. On August 2nd, advanced Prussian cavalry patrols crossed into Alsace and encountered scattered French outposts, driving them back. On August 4th, 1870, the German Third Army, over 40,000 men strong, descended on the small French garrison town of Wissembourg in northern Alsace. The French had 5,000 soldiers there under General Abel Douay, dug in around the town holding defensive positions along a ridgeline. Douay expected skirmishes, maybe a probing attack, but he didn't expect what came next. At dawn, German artillery opened fire from the surrounding hills. Shells rained down on the French positions with accuracy that shocked the defenders. Buildings exploded, stone walls collapsed, and men scrambled for cover, but the bombardment didn't stop. It intensified. Then the German infantry came in waves of Prussian soldiers advancing in coordinated columns, supported by more artillery rolling forward. French chassepot rifles cracked from windows and rooftops, dropping attackers at long range. The weapon worked exactly as advertised, but for every German who fell, 3 more took his place. General Douay rode forward to rally his men when a shell burst directly overhead. Shrapnel tore through him, and he died instantly. His soldiers, leaderless and overwhelmed, fought for hours, contesting every street, every garden wall, every house. But by evening, Wissembourg was in German hands. French casualties exceeded 2,000 killed, wounded, or captured. German casualties were roughly the same, but strategically it was a complete German victory. The road into Alsace was open, and the French high command realized far too late that this wasn't going to be the war they'd imagined. 2 days later, on August 6, 1870, at the village of Froschwiller in Alsace, Marshal Patrice de MacMahon had positioned his army on high ground overlooking the village. It was a strong defensive position with stone walls, hedgerows, and slopes that would force any attacker to advance uphill under fire. He commanded roughly 45,000 men who were dug in well. MacMahon knew the Germans were coming and intended to hold this position long enough to delay their advance, buy time for reinforcements, then withdraw in good order. He expected a fight, but he didn't expect what Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm brought with him. The Crown Prince, commanding the German Third Army, had over 120,000 men converging on Froschwiller from 3 directions, and more importantly, he had something the French didn't: mass Krupp artillery. The battle opened just after dawn. German batteries unlimbered on ridges 2 kilometers away, far beyond the range of French guns, then opened fire. The sound was unlike anything most French soldiers had ever heard, not the crack of muskets or the pop of small field guns, but deep rolling thunder. Shells weighing 30 pounds arced through the morning air and slammed into French positions with devastating precision. Buildings disintegrated, stone walls exploded into shrapnel, men crouched behind cover and were buried when that cover collapsed on top of them, and ammunition wagons detonated in fireballs that sent debris hundreds of meters in every direction. French artillery tried to return fire, but their guns couldn't reach the German positions. Crews fired anyway, shells falling uselessly short until German counterfire found them and blew the guns apart. For 2 hours, the bombardment continued without pause. Then the German infantry advanced. They came in waves, company after company, moving forward in coordinated columns supported by artillery that shifted fire ahead of them. French officers shouted orders, and soldiers gripped their chassepot rifles and waited. At 400 meters, the French opened fire. The chassepot was everything it was supposed to be: accurate, fast-loading, lethal at range. French volleys tore into the advancing German lines. Men dropped by the dozen, entire ranks collapsed, officers fell, and color-bearers went down with their flags. The Germans pulled back, regrouped, and came again. This time they brought more artillery forward. Batteries rolled to within a kilometer and began firing directly into French defensive positions. Shells landed among the infantry, scattering bodies and shredding formations. Under that covering fire, German infantry surged forward again. The fighting became brutal and close. Prussian soldiers reached the stone walls and fought hand-to-hand with French defenders using bayonets, rifle butts, and knives. Men grappled in the dirt. Villages changed hands twice, 3 times. Smoke filled the streets so thick that soldiers couldn't see 10 meters ahead. McMahon, watching his center begin to buckle, made a desperate decision. He ordered the cavalry to charge. French cuirassiers, heavy cavalry in steel breastplates and plumed helmets, formed up behind the lines. These were elite troops, descendants of the men who charged at Austerlitz and Waterloo. Their armor gleamed, their horses stamped and snorted, sabers were drawn, the trumpet sounded, and they rode. Hundreds of horsemen thundered across open ground toward the German lines. It was magnificent, but it was also suicide. German infantry entrenched behind walls and in buildings leveled their rifles and fired in coordinated volleys. Horses screamed and went down with legs shattered. Riders were thrown from saddles and crushed beneath falling mounts. And men who reached the German positions were shot point blank or bayoneted as they tried to jump the walls. The charge lasted less than 10 minutes. When it broke, the field was littered with dead and dying horses, their riders trapped beneath them or staggering back on foot. The cuirassiers had achieved nothing except their own destruction. By early afternoon, McMahon's position was collapsing. German forces had turned both flanks. The center was under overwhelming artillery fire. Reserves were exhausted, and ammunition was running low. At 3 in the afternoon, McMahon gave the order to retreat. What began as an organized withdrawal turned into a rout within the hour. Soldiers streamed westward, abandoning rifles, packs, anything that slowed them down. Roads became clogged with wagons, artillery limbers, and walking wounded. German cavalry pursued, cutting down stragglers and capturing entire companies that couldn't keep pace. Villages along the retreat routes were left burning, and civilians fled alongside the soldiers. By nightfall, McMahon's army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. French casualties at Worth exceeded 11,000 killed and wounded, with another 9,000 captured. German casualties were also heavy, over 10,000 fallen, but they held the field. More importantly, they'd shattered one of France's 2 main armies and opened the road deeper into Alsace. And that same day, 100 kilometers to the north at Spicheren, near the city of Saarbrücken, Prussian forces attacked a French defensive position on high ground. The French were again well-positioned behind stone walls and fortifications, and again they fought hard. But again, German numbers and artillery wore them down. By evening, the French withdrew. Another defeat, another retreat. In 3 days, on August 4th at Wissembourg and August 6th at Wörth and Spicheren, France had lost 3 battles in 2 entire provinces. Alsace was gone, and the road to Metz in the French heartland lay open. The news reached Paris on August 7th, and the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The same crowds that had chanted "À Berlin" a week earlier now gathered outside government buildings demanding explanations. Newspapers that had promised swift victory now screamed about betrayal and incompetence. The truth was simpler and more terrible. France had gone to war unprepared, and now it was paying the price in blood. Marshal Bazaine, still at Metz with the largest French force, now faced a nightmare scenario. The Germans weren't just advancing, they were converging. Moltke's 3 armies were moving to encircle Bazaine before he could retreat westward or link up with what remained of McMahon's shattered forces. Bazaine had one chance: break out west toward Verdun, regroup, and form a new defensive line before the German trap closed. He had to move fast. He had to move now. But Bazaine hesitated. And while he hesitated, the Prussian First and Second Armies, nearly 200,000 men, moved into position to cut him off. On August 14th, Bazaine finally gave the order to move. His army would march west along the roads toward Verdun, taking everything they could carry: wagons, artillery, supplies. It was 2 days too late. Moltke had already anticipated the move. On August 16th, Bazaine's columns stretched for kilometers along the roads heading west. Infantry marched in long lines. Artillery batteries rolled slowly over dirt roads, churned into mud by thousands of boots, and supply wagons creaked under the weight of ammunition and provisions. It was an army on the move, but it was slow, cumbersome, and vulnerable. Near the village of Mars-la-Tour, the road passed through open farmland. French advance units moved through the area cautiously, scouts reporting no enemy contact. Then, just after midday, Prussian cavalry appeared on the horizon. Behind them came infantry, then artillery. It was the Prussian Third Corps, barely 30,000 men, but they were directly across Bazaine's line of retreat. If the French didn't break through immediately, the entire German Second Army would arrive, and the trap would close permanently. What followed was 14 hours of savage, chaotic combat across open farmland. French infantry attacked in massed columns, trying to sweep the Prussians aside. German artillery tore into those columns at close range, turning wheat fields into killing grounds. Prussian infantry, badly outnumbered, formed defensive squares and fired volleys into French attacks. Villages became fortresses. Vionville changed hands 3 times. Each side fed reinforcements into the fight as they arrived. French regiments marching straight from the road into combat. Prussian battalions running forward to plug gaps in the line. By mid-afternoon, the battle had devolved into a brutal stalemate. Neither side could break the other. The French couldn't punch through, and the Prussians couldn't hold much longer. Then General Friedrich Wilhelm von Bredow made a decision that would enter military legend. Bredow commanded the Prussian 12th Cavalry Brigade, roughly 800 horsemen. He could see that the Prussian center was collapsing under French pressure. If it broke, the entire 3 Corps would be routed and Bazaine would escape. The only way to buy time for reinforcements to arrive was to disrupt the French attack. He ordered a cavalry charge directly into the center of the French line, straight into massed artillery and infantry. His officers understood what that meant. It was a suicide mission, but it might work. At 2 in the afternoon, the trumpets sounded. 800 cavalry, cuirassiers and lancers formed up and began to trot forward, then canter, then full gallop. They rode across a kilometer of open ground directly toward French gun positions. French artillery crews saw them coming and loaded canister, anti-personnel rounds filled with metal balls that turned cannons into giant shotguns. The first volley shredded the front ranks. Horses went down in heaps and men were blown from saddles. The charge didn't slow. French infantry formed squares and fired disciplined volleys. More riders fell. Survivors spurred their mounts faster, leaning low, sabers drawn. They hit the French gun line like a hammer. Cavalry smashed into artillery crews, cutting them down before they could reload. Horses trampled gunners, and lances punched through infantry formations. For 3 minutes, chaos reigned in the French rear. Then French reserves counterattacked. The cavalry, now deep inside enemy lines and cut off, were surrounded. They fought their way back out, leaving half their number dead or dying in the fields. Of the 800 who charged, fewer than 400 made it back. But they'd done it. The French attack stalled. Prussian reinforcements arrived and stabilized the line. By nightfall, both armies were exhausted and the battleground to a halt. Casualties were staggering. Over 16,000 French killed and wounded, nearly 15,000 Prussians. But strategically, the Prussians had won. Bazaine's retreat had been stopped. He was still within a day's march of Metz, and the full weight of the German Second Army was now closing in from the north. Bazaine made his second critical mistake. Instead of forcing a march through the night to get clear, he ordered his army to rest and regroup. 2 days later, the price of that decision came due. On August 18, 1870, at the villages of Gravelotte and Saint-Privat, just west of Metz, Moltke brought everything he had. The Prussian First and Second Armies, over 200,000 men, deployed along a front stretching for kilometers across ridges and valleys. Facing them were 170,000 French troops in strong defensive positions behind stone walls, in fortified villages, and along ridge lines. This would be the largest battle of the war and one of the bloodiest. The Prussian First Army attacked first, hitting the French southern flank near Gravelotte. The assault turned into a slaughter. French chassepot fire cut down Prussian infantry in rows. Artillery pounded German columns as they advanced uphill. Entire battalions were shredded trying to take a single stone wall. For hours, the Prussians battered themselves against the French defenses and achieved nothing except mounting casualties. Moltke shifted his focus north to Saint-Privat, where the French right flank anchored on a fortified village. If the Prussians could break through there, they could roll up the entire French line. He committed the Prussian Guard Corps, the elite of the Prussian army, over 20,000 men, the best trained and most disciplined troops Germany possessed. At 5 in the evening, the Guard advanced. They moved in parade ground formation with neat ranks, officers leading from the front, regimental colors flying, and bands playing. It looked like a peacetime review, not a combat assault. The French, entrenched in Saint-Privat with clear fields of fire, couldn't believe what they were seeing. At 600 meters, French rifles opened fire. Chassepot bullets ripped through the advancing ranks. Men fell by the dozens, then hundreds. Officers were cut down. The neat formations began to disintegrate, but the Guard kept coming. At 400 meters, French artillery joined in. Shells burst among the packed infantry. Entire companies vanished in explosions of dirt and shrapnel. The Guard reached 200 meters from the village, then 100. They were walking into a firestorm. Men were falling so fast that the rear ranks had to step over bodies to keep advancing, and then the advance stopped. Even the Guard Corps couldn't take more. Survivors went to ground, taking cover in ditches and behind low walls. Officers tried to rally them for another push, but it was hopeless. The units had been gutted. In less than 2 hours, the Prussian Guards suffered over 8,000 casualties, one of the most catastrophic tactical failures of the entire war. But while the Guard was dying in front of Saint-Privat, Saxon troops from the German Second Army had been working around the French northern flank. They hit the French from the side, pouring fire into positions that had been focused entirely on the Guard. The French line buckled. Units began pulling back from Saint-Privat to avoid encirclement. That pullback exposed the units to their south. Within an hour, the entire French right flank was in retreat. Bazaine, watching his line collapse, gave the order to withdraw into the fortifications of Metz. By nightfall, the French army was streaming back toward the city. The withdrawal was orderly. This wasn't a rout, but it was a retreat nonetheless. The Prussians held the field. Their casualties were horrific, over 20,000 killed and wounded. French losses were also severe, around 12,000. But the strategic result was clear and final. By August 20th, Prussian forces had completely encircled Metz. Bazaine's army, 173,000 men, the professional corps of the French military, was now trapped inside a fortified city with limited supplies and no way out. Moltke didn't need to assault the city. He just needed to wait. Starvation would do the rest. In Paris, the news sent shockwaves through the government. Without Bazaine's army, France had almost nothing left to stop the German advance. A few scattered garrisons, McMahon's battered remnants still trying to regroup, and newly raised conscript units with no training and no equipment. The war was effectively over. Everyone knew it. But Napoleon III couldn't surrender. Not yet. The empire would collapse and revolution would follow. He needed one more chance, one desperate, impossible gamble to salvage something from the catastrophe. So he made the worst decision of his life. He ordered McMahon to march northeast with whatever forces he could scrape together and attempt to relieve Metz. It was madness. McMahon's army was shattered and under strength. The roads were crawling with German forces. Any march toward Metz would be shadowed, harassed, and eventually trapped. But orders were orders. On August 23rd, McMahon began moving northeast with roughly 120,000 men, a mix of demoralized survivors from Worth, untrained conscripts, and depot troops pulled from garrisons. Moltke watched the French army march straight into his trap and redeployed accordingly. The German Third Army would shadow McMahon from the south, and a new force, the Army of the Meuse under the Crown Prince of Saxony, would block him from the north. The net was closing again, and this time there would be no escape. The march was a nightmare from the start. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Wagons bogged down. Artillery pieces sank to their axles and had to be dragged free by exhausted men. Units lost contact with each other in the confusion. Soldiers marched for hours without food because supply wagons couldn't keep up. Worse, the Germans were watching. Prussian cavalry shadowed the French columns from a distance, tracking every movement. Moltke received regular updates on McMahon's position, direction, and speed. McMahon was being herded. By late August, he realized the trap. German forces were on both flanks, and more were moving ahead to cut off any approach to Metz. If he continued northeast, he'd be surrounded and destroyed. If he turned back toward Paris, the empire would fall, and he'd be blamed for cowardice. On August 30th, McMahon made a decision. He would swing north toward the Belgian border, march along the frontier where the Germans couldn't easily encircle him, then turn east and try to slip past the German forces into Metz. It was still a long shot, but it was better than walking straight into annihilation. He changed course and headed north, but the Germans had already anticipated the move. Crown Prince Albert of Saxony, commanding the Army of the Meuse, repositioned his forces to block the northern route. Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm brought the Third Army up from the south. The two German forces were converging on a single point, a small fortress town in a loop of the Meuse River, right on the Belgian border. Sedan. McMahon didn't choose Sedan, he was pushed there. On August 31st, French advance units reached the town and found it largely empty, just a small garrison and some local militia. The town sat in a natural bowl, surrounded on three sides by wooded hills and ridges. The Meuse River curved around it to the north, and the Belgian border lay just a few kilometers beyond. McMahon's officers urged him to keep moving, to cross into Belgium if necessary, anything but stop here. But the army was exhausted. Men were collapsing on the roads. Horses were dying from overwork. Units were scattered across kilometers of countryside. McMahon ordered a halt. The army would rest in and around Sedan, regroup overnight, then resume the march at dawn. That night, German forces moved into position. Over 200,000 troops closed in on Sedan from three directions: east, south, and west. Under cover of darkness, artillery batteries were hauled up onto the surrounding ridges. Crews unlimbered over 400 guns in a ring around the valley, sighting them down on the town and the fields below. Engineers strung telegraph wire between command posts so that Moltke could coordinate the entire operation in real time. Cavalry units positioned themselves to cut off any retreat routes. Infantry divisions dug in along the high ground. By midnight, the trap was set. Inside Sedan, French soldiers tried to rest. Most couldn't. They could hear movement in the hills. Horses, wagons, the distant sound of metal on metal. Scouts reported campfires on the ridges. Officers knew what was coming, but didn't know how to stop it. Napoleon III was with the army. He joined McMahon weeks earlier, desperate to be seen with his troops to share their danger, to salvage some shred of honor from the disaster. Now he was trapped with them. The emperor spent the night in a house near the citadel. He couldn't sleep. Bladder pain racked him. Aides brought him opiate drafts, but they barely helped. He sat in a chair, staring at maps that no longer mattered, listening to the sounds of an army that had run out of options. He'd wanted to die in battle, a glorious death worthy of the Bonaparte name, something that history would remember with respect, maybe even admiration. Instead, he was about to be caged like an animal and paraded as a trophy. At 4 a.m, French sentries on the eastern edge of Sedan reported movement on the ridges, shadows shifting in the pre-dawn darkness, the metallic sound of gun carriages being positioned. Officers woke their men. Soldiers grabbed rifles and stumbled into formation, groggy and confused. Cavalry units saddled horses. Artillery crews prepared their guns, though they had no idea where to aim. The sky began to lighten. A cold mist hung over the valley. At 5 a.m, the sun broke over the hills to the east, and the German guns opened fire. The first shells landed in the French camps east of Sedan before most men were fully awake. Explosions ripped through tents and bivouacs. Men were killed in their bedrolls. Horses tethered to wagons were torn apart, screaming and thrashing in their harnesses. Ammunition caissons detonated in chain reactions, sending fire and shrapnel across entire companies. Within minutes, over 400 German guns were firing in coordinated volleys. The bombardment wasn't random. Prussian artillery officers had scouted the valley the night before and marked targets. French artillery positions, command posts, supply depots, troop concentrations. Telegraph lines connected the gun batteries to forward observers on the ridges who could see the entire battlefield and adjust fire in real time. Shells arced down from three sides. There was no safe ground. French artillery tried to return fire, but they were shooting uphill at enemies they couldn't see, while German guns on the high ground could observe every French position. One by one, French batteries were identified, targeted, and destroyed. By 6 in the morning, most French guns had been silenced. The infantry had nowhere to go. Sedan itself offered some cover, stone buildings, cellars, walls. But the town was small and already overcrowded. The fields outside were open and exposed. Men crouched in ditches, pressed themselves against walls, hid behind wagons. It didn't matter. The shells found them anyway. McMahon, trying to organize a defense, was hit by shrapnel at 6:30 in the morning. The wound wasn't fatal, but it took him out of action. Command passed to General Ducrot, who immediately ordered a breakout to the west, the only direction not yet completely sealed. French divisions began moving, trying to fight their way out of the valley before the German ring closed entirely. They ran straight into the Bavarian Corps. Bavarian infantry, positioned on the western ridges, opened fire on the French columns as they advanced uphill. French troops pushed forward under withering rifle fire, taking casualties with every step. Some units made it to within 100 meters of the German positions before being forced back by coordinated volleys and artillery fire from flanking batteries. Ducrot's breakout failed within 2 hours. By 9 in the morning, German forces had completed the encirclement. Every road, every path, every possible escape route was blocked. The Meuse River cut off retreat to the north. The bridges were under German artillery fire. The Belgian border was tantalizingly close, just a few kilometers away. But German cavalry patrolled the approaches. Any French unit that tried to cross into Belgium would be cut down before it reached neutral territory. McMahon's replacement, General de Wimpfen, took command and refused to accept the situation. He ordered another breakout attempt, this time to the northeast, aimed at the village of Flowing. If French forces could seize Flowing and the high ground beyond it, they might punch a hole through the German lines large enough to escape toward Metz, or at least avoid complete annihilation. General Margaret commanded the cavalry division tasked with spearheading the attack. He assembled his regiments, Chasseurs d'Afrique and Hussars, some of the finest light cavalry France possessed, and prepared to charge. At 11 in the morning, Marguerite led his men forward. A Prussian bullet struck him in the face before the charge was 100 meters old. He fell from his saddle, blood pouring from the wound. His second-in-command, General Gallifet, took over without breaking stride. "As far as you can, gentlemen, as far as you can." 800 horsemen spurred their mounts into a gallop. They rode across open ground toward German infantry entrenched in Flowing in the woods beyond. Rifle fire met them at 300 meters, disciplined, measured volleys from soldiers in prepared positions. Horses collapsed mid-stride. Riders were thrown forward and crushed. The survivors pressed on. At 100 meters, the fire intensified. German infantry formed into dense firing lines and unleashed everything they had. The front ranks of the French cavalry disintegrated. Men and horses went down in tangled heaps. A few, maybe 50, reached the German positions. They crashed into infantry squares, sabers swinging, trying to break through. They were swarmed, pulled from their horses, bayoneted, shot at point-blank range. Gallifet, somehow still alive, rallied the survivors and pulled back. He regrouped and charged again and again. 3 times he led his men forward, and 3 times they were shattered. By noon, the French cavalry had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The breakout at Flowing had failed. There would be no escape. Inside Sedan, the situation was beyond desperate. Shells fell continuously. The town was burning in a dozen places. Streets were choked with wounded men, thousands of them lying on cobblestones, in doorways and courtyards. The medical services had collapsed. There weren't enough doctors, enough bandages, enough morphine. Men lay screaming or silent, waiting for help that wouldn't come. Civilians huddled in cellars, families crowded together in basements while the world above them exploded. Some buildings took direct hits and collapsed, burying everyone inside. Napoleon III emerged from his quarters and mounted his horse. He wore a simple general's uniform with no decorations. His face was pale, his movements slow and stiff. Aides tried to convince him to stay inside, but he refused. If his soldiers were dying, he would be seen among them. He rode through the burning streets of Sedan, shells bursting around him. Soldiers saw their emperor and didn't know whether to cheer or weep. Some saluted, others just stared. A few shouted for him to surrender and end the slaughter. Napoleon had come to Sedan hoping to die. A bullet, a shell, something clean and final that would end the humiliation and give him a death worthy of his name. But the shells kept missing. He rode for over an hour through the chaos, untouched, while men died around him. It became clear that death would not come for him, not today. By 1 in the afternoon, organized resistance had ended. French units were still fighting, soldiers firing from windows, defending street corners, contesting rubble. But there was no plan, no coordination, no hope. It was just men refusing to quit while they still had ammunition. General de Wimpfen met with his officers. The situation was explained in blunt terms. The army was trapped, surrounded, being systematically destroyed by artillery it couldn't answer. Ammunition was running low. Thousands were already dead or wounded. Continuing the fight meant annihilation. Wimpfen resisted. He'd been given command just hours ago. To surrender now would stain his name forever. His officers told him the alternative was worse. If the Germans stormed the town, the slaughter would be total. Wounded men would be killed. Civilians would die in the crossfire. Sedan would become a tomb. At 4 in the afternoon, a white flag was raised over the citadel. The German guns stopped firing. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. Men's ears rang. Smoke drifted through the streets. The only sounds were the moans of the wounded and the crackle of burning buildings. Napoleon III sat down and wrote a letter in his own hand. Monsieur mon frère, not having been able to die in the midst of my troops, it only remains for me to surrender my sword into your Majesty's hands. I am your Majesty's good brother, Napoleon. The letter was sent under flag of truce to King Wilhelm I. Bismarck received it first. He read it, showed it to Wilhelm, and immediately began drafting surrender terms. There would be no negotiation. The entire French army would lay down its arms and surrender as prisoners of war. Officers could keep their swords if they gave their word not to fight again. The emperor would be taken into custody. Napoleon requested a meeting, not with Wilhelm, that would be too humiliating, but with Bismarck. The next morning, September 2nd, Napoleon and Bismarck met at a weaver's cottage on the road outside Sedan. It was a small, plain structure, deliberately chosen. The Emperor of France would surrender in a peasant's house. Napoleon arrived in a simple carriage wearing his uniform. He looked exhausted, older than his 62 years. Bismarck, in his white cuirassier uniform with the Iron Cross at his throat, greeted him with cold, formal courtesy. They spoke briefly. Napoleon asked for lenient terms. Bismarck refused. The surrender would be unconditional. Napoleon asked if he could at least retain some dignity. Bismarck said the dignity of France ended when it declared war. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Over the next 2 days, 104,000 French soldiers laid down their arms. They stacked rifles in huge piles, unbuckled cartridge belts, formed into columns under German guard, and began the long march to prisoner of war camps in Germany. Many wept openly, others walked in stunned silence. Some shouted curses at their officers, blaming them for the disaster. Napoleon III was taken to comfortable but guarded quarters at the Château de Bellevue, then transferred to Germany and held at the Palace of Wilhelmshöhe near Kassel. He would remain there, a prisoner and former emperor, while France tore itself apart. On September 4th, news of Sedan reached Paris, and the city exploded. The telegram reached Paris at 11 in the morning. Emperor captured, army surrendered, over 100,000 prisoners. For a moment, the city seemed to freeze. Then it erupted. Crowds poured into the streets. Thousands converged on the Place de la Concorde, the Tuileries Palace, the Legislative Assembly. They weren't celebrating. They were enraged. Déchéance! Déchéance! Overthrow! Overthrow! The Second Empire had promised glory and delivered catastrophe. In 6 weeks, France had lost every major battle, surrendered 2 armies, and watched its emperor taken prisoner like a common soldier. By early afternoon, the Legislative Assembly was surrounded. Crowds pushed past guards and filled the galleries. Deputies tried to maintain order, but it was useless. The session dissolved into chaos. At 3 in the afternoon, a group of Republican deputies walked out of the assembly and marched to the Hôtel de Ville, the historic seat of Parisian revolutionary government. Crowds followed, chanting for a republic. From the balcony of the Hôtel de Ville, Deputy Léon Gambetta proclaimed the end of the Second Empire and the establishment of a government of national defense. The empire was abolished. France was once again a republic. General Louis-Jules Trochu was named military governor of Paris. Gambetta became Minister of the Interior. Other moderate Republicans filled the cabinet. They made immediate promises. France would continue the war. The nation would fight on, not for Napoleon, not for the empire, but for the republic, for France itself, for survival. We will not cede an inch of our territory or a stone of our fortresses. It was stirring rhetoric, but it meant absolutely nothing. The professional French army had been destroyed. Bazaine's 173,000 men were still trapped at Metz with no way out in dwindling supplies. MacMahon's force had surrendered at Sedan. What remained was scattered garrisons, untrained conscripts, and militia units with more enthusiasm than ammunition. The government of national defense had no army, no plan, and no realistic chance of victory. But surrender was politically impossible. If the new Republican government sued for peace immediately, it would be seen as weak, traitorous, complicit in the empire's failures. The regime would collapse before it even began, so they committed to fighting a war they'd already lost. Gambetta, energetic and fiercely patriotic, took charge of organizing resistance in the provinces. On October 7th, he escaped the encirclement of Paris in a hot air balloon, drifting over German lines in a wicker basket. Landing in the countryside, and immediately beginning the work of raising new armies, these provincial forces, ragged, poorly trained, often led by officers with no combat experience, would launch attacks on German supply lines, win minor skirmishes, even briefly recapture the city of Orléans. They fought with courage and determination, but they couldn't break through to Paris, and they couldn't stop what was coming. At Metz, Bazaine's situation had become untenable. The city was under full siege. Prussian forces surrounded it completely, cutting off all supply routes. Food ran low. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Soldiers went on half rations, then quarter rations. Disease spread in the overcrowded conditions. Bazaine made no serious attempt to break out. He negotiated intermittently with the Germans, holding out hope for some kind of political settlement. His officers grew frustrated, then angry. Soldiers began to mutter about treason. On October 27, 1870, Bazaine surrendered. 173,000 French soldiers, the largest intact force France had left, laid down their arms and marched into captivity. The surrender was conducted under terms that many considered suspiciously generous to Bazaine personally. Accusations of treason followed him for the rest of his life. He would eventually be court-martialed, convicted, and imprisoned. But the damage was done. France had now lost both of its main field armies. Moltke was free to redeploy his forces, and there was only one target left that mattered: Paris. By mid-September, German armies had begun closing in on the French capital. The city's outer fortifications, a ring of walls and detached forts built in the 1840s, had been hastily strengthened. Trenches were dug. Artillery was positioned. Supplies were stockpiled. Over 400,000 men were mobilized to defend the city, but most were National Guard, militia with minimal training, armed with outdated rifles, led by elected officers who had no military experience. The city's population swelled to nearly 2 million as refugees flooded in from the surrounding countryside. Livestock were driven through the gates to supplement food supplies. Warehouses were filled with flour, salted meat, and preserved goods. The government pledged to hold the city at all costs. Paris would never surrender. The people would starve before they capitulated. On September 19, 1870, the German armies completed their encirclement. Paris was cut off from the outside world. No supplies would enter, no reinforcements would arrive, no communication except by balloon or carrier pigeon. 2 million people were sealed inside a city with finite resources, facing an enemy that didn't need to attack. Moltke deployed his forces in a loose cordon around the city and ordered them to wait. German artillery bombarded the outer forts periodically, testing the defenses. French sorties, desperate attempts to break through the German lines, were launched and repulsed with regularity. But the Germans didn't storm the walls. They didn't need to. Time was on their side. Inside Paris, the mood was defiant at first. Posters went up declaring that the city would never yield. Newspapers printed stories of past French victories, invoking the spirit of the revolution, calling on citizens to resist as their grandfathers had resisted the tyrants of Europe. But as September turned to October, reality began to set in. Food prices rose, bread was rationed, meat became scarce, the livestock that had been driven into the city was slaughtered, and within weeks the supply was gone. By November, Parisians were eating horse meat, then dogs, then cats, then rats. The winter of 1870-71 was cold and fuel ran out. Trees in the parks were cut down for firewood. People burned furniture, books, anything that would keep them warm, and the Germans just waited. The siege tightened. The city starved. And the clock ran down toward a conclusion that everyone could see coming, but no one wanted to admit. Paris was dying, and when it fell, the war would be over. October became November. November became December. By late October, butchers were selling horse meat at premium prices. Families who'd never considered eating horse now lined up for it. Within 2 weeks, the horses were gone. Not just the ones brought in for food, but working horses, cavalry mounts, even the horses that pulled the omnibuses through the streets. Then the dogs and cats vanished. Pet owners who'd resisted at first gave in when their children cried from hunger. By December, rat catchers were doing profitable business. Rats sold for 1 franc each in the markets. People bought them, skinned them, cooked them, and called it meat. The Paris Zoo became a butcher shop. And in late November, the exotic animals were slaughtered. 2 elephants named Castor and Pollux were killed and butchered. Their meat was sold in high-end restaurants for 40 francs a pound. Zebra, camel, kangaroo, all went under the knife. Bread rations dropped to 300 grams per person per day, then 250, then less. The bread itself became inedible, a mixture of wheat, sawdust, and whatever filler the bakers could find. It tasted like paste and sat in the stomach like stone. People grew thin. Children stopped playing in the streets. The elderly began dying quietly in their apartments, from hunger, from cold, from diseases that spread in the unsanitary conditions. Smallpox swept through the overcrowded neighborhoods, then typhoid, then dysentery. The death rate climbed every week. Coffins became scarce. Bodies were buried in mass graves outside the city walls. And through it all, the German guns fired intermittently at the outer forts, a constant reminder that the enemy was still there, still waiting. The Government of National Defense launched sorties, attempts to break the encirclement by force, but every sortie ended the same way. Brave men dying for nothing, the German ring unbroken, and the city's hope fading a little more. Communication with the outside world was limited to balloons and pigeons. Starting in September, the French launched hot air balloons over the German lines. 66 balloons were sent up over the course of the siege, carrying mail, passengers, and orders to the provincial forces. Some made it, others drifted into German hands, or were lost in the countryside. Inside Paris, political tensions boiled over. Radical factions, socialists, revolutionaries, hardline Republicans demanded that the government arm the people fully and launch a mass uprising. They accused Trochu and the moderates of defeatism, of planning to surrender, of betraying the Republic. On October 31st, radicals briefly seized the Hôtel de Ville and attempted a coup. It failed, but it revealed how fragile the government's authority had become. Trochu, increasingly isolated and exhausted, privately believed the situation was hopeless, but publicly he continued to promise victory. By early January 1871, Paris was on the edge of collapse. The bread ration had fallen below 200 grams. Fuel was almost gone. People huddled in unheated apartments wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned. The death toll from starvation and disease exceeded 3,000 per week. Morale had shattered. Soldiers deserted their posts. National Guard units refused orders. The government knew it couldn't hold out much longer. Days, maybe 2 weeks at most. And then the Germans made their final move. On January 5th, 1871, Prussian artillery began shelling Paris itself. Not the forts, not the defensive positions, but the city. Long-range siege guns were brought forward and positioned on the heights south of Paris. These were massive weapons, firing shells weighing over 250 pounds, capable of reaching deep into the city. The bombardment began at night. Shells fell on residential neighborhoods in the southern arrondissements. Buildings collapsed. Families were killed in their homes. One shell hit a hospital, killing patients in their beds. Another destroyed a school. The bombardment wasn't designed to conquer Paris. It was designed to break it. For 3 weeks, shells fell randomly on the city. There was no pattern, no warning. A street could be safe one moment and obliterated the next. People stopped going outside. The psychological effect was devastating. This wasn't soldiers dying on a battlefield. This was civilians, women, children, the elderly being killed in their neighborhoods for no reason other than to make the city surrender. By mid-January, bread riots broke out. Crowds attacked bakeries demanding food that didn't exist. Troops were called in to restore order, but the troops were starving too. On January 22nd, radicals launched another uprising, this time targeting the Hôtel de Ville with armed mobs. Government forces fired on the crowd. Dozens were killed. The uprising collapsed, but it proved that the city was eating itself alive. Trochu met with his cabinet on January 26th. The military situation was explained in stark terms. The army had no capacity for further offensive action. The National Guard was demoralized and unreliable. Food supplies would be exhausted within days. Disease was rampant. Civilian deaths were climbing. Continued resistance meant mass starvation and the possible destruction of the city. Trochu asked for options. There were none. On January 28, 1871, the Government of National Defense authorized negotiations for an armistice. A delegation was sent under white flag to German headquarters at Versailles. Bismarck dictated the terms. Paris would surrender. French forces would lay down their arms. The city's forts would be turned over to German control. An armistice would be signed, leading to a formal peace treaty. France had no leverage. The delegation accepted. On January 29th, the guns fell silent. On March 1st, German troops marched into Paris. It was a limited symbolic occupation, 30,000 soldiers entering the city, marching down the Champs-Élysées, passing through the Arc de Triomphe, then withdrawing after a single day. But the message was clear and unmistakable. Paris, the unconquerable city, the heart of the French Republic, had been broken. The siege had lasted 132 days. Civilian deaths from starvation and disease numbered over 30,000. Military casualties from the failed sorties exceeded 50,000. And the humiliation wasn't over, because while Paris had been starving, Bismarck had been preparing a ceremony. 18 kilometers southwest of the capital, in the Palace of Versailles, the greatest symbol of French royal power, something unprecedented was about to take place. The crowning of a German emperor on French soil in the Hall of Mirrors. Versailles had not been a royal residence since the Revolution. For nearly 80 years, the palace had stood mostly empty, a monument to a dead monarchy. In September 1870, when German armies encircled Paris, Prussian High Command established headquarters 18 kilometers southwest at Versailles. It was a practical choice, close enough to coordinate the siege, far enough to avoid French artillery, with enough space to house staff, officers, and support units. But it was also a symbolic choice. Versailles had been built by Louis XIV, the Sun King, as the ultimate expression of French dominance in Europe. Every room, every statue, every gilded surface declared that France was the center of the world, and all other nations orbited around it. Now it was filled with Prussian boots and German voices. Bismarck saw the opportunity immediately. The war had accomplished exactly what he designed it to do. The southern German states had fought alongside Prussia against France. They had bled together, won together, and now they were willing to take the final step. Political unification under Prussian leadership. In November and December, as Paris starved, Bismarck negotiated with the southern kings and princes. There were objections, hesitations, demands for autonomy. Bismarck promised concessions, offered titles, made deals. By early January, the agreements were in place. A unified German empire would be proclaimed, and King Wilhelm I of Prussia would become its emperor. The ceremony could have been held in Berlin, in Frankfurt, in any number of German cities. But Bismarck wanted it here, at Versailles, in the Hall of Mirrors. He wanted France to watch its own palace become the birthplace of German power. The Hall of Mirrors was the most magnificent room in Europe. It stretched 73 meters long, lined on one side with 17 arched windows overlooking the gardens, and on the other with 17 corresponding mirrors that reflected the light and made the space seem infinite. The ceiling was covered in painted frescoes depicting the military victories of Louis XIV. Chandeliers hung from golden fixtures. The floor was polished marble. French kings had received ambassadors here, signed treaties here, celebrated victories here. It was designed to intimidate anyone who entered, a physical manifestation of French supremacy. Now in January 1871, it was being prepared for a German coronation. Wilhelm II was deeply uncomfortable with the entire affair. The 73-year-old king had spent his life as King of Prussia and was content with that. He saw himself as a Prussian monarch, not a German emperor. He worried that taking the title of emperor would diminish Prussian sovereignty, that it would make him subordinate to some abstract Germany rather than master of his own kingdom. He argued with Bismarck repeatedly. He wanted to be called Emperor of Germany, implying rulership over the nation. Bismarck insisted on German Emperor, a more neutral title that wouldn't offend the southern kings. The argument continued until days before the ceremony. In the end, Wilhelm gave in. Bismarck always won. January 18th, 1871, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The Hall of Mirrors filled with officers. Over 600 men in dress uniforms stood in ranks along both sides of the hall. Generals, colonels, staff officers, representatives from every corps, every division that had fought in the war. At the far end of the hall, a temporary platform had been erected. Wilhelm stood there, flanked by his son, Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm, and his son-in-law, Grand Duke Friedrich of Baden. Behind them stood the commanders, Moltke, Roon, and the other architects of victory. Bismarck, in his white cuirassier uniform, with the Iron Cross at his throat, stepped forward. The room fell silent. He held a document in his hand, the proclamation of the German Empire. He read in a clear, strong voice. The proclamation declared the restoration of the German Empire, dissolved since 1806 when Napoleon Bonaparte had destroyed the Holy Roman Empire. It named Wilhelm I as Kaiser, Emperor. It outlined the structure of the new state, the roles of the federal princes, the unity of the German people. It was dry, bureaucratic language, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. Germany, divided for centuries into dozens of competing states, was now unified, and it had been forged in the fires of war against France. When Bismarck finished reading, Grand Duke Friedrich of Baden raised his hand. "Long live His Imperial and Royal Majesty, Emperor Wilhelm." The hall erupted. Swords were drawn and raised. Helmets were lifted into the air. Officers shouted in unison, "Hoch! Hoch! Hoch! Long live!" The sound echoed through the hall, through the palace, out into the cold January air. Wilhelm stood stiffly, his face showing little emotion. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the cheers, but those close to him could see he wasn't pleased. But it was done. The German Empire had been born, not in a German city, not on German soil, but in the heart of France's most sacred royal palace. It was a calculated insult, and everyone knew it. The ceremony lasted less than an hour. Afterward, officers filed out into the gardens where champagne and food had been prepared. Toasts were made, bands played. The mood was celebratory but restrained. Professional soldiers marking a job completed, not a mob celebrating conquest. Bismarck stood apart, smoking a cigar, watching the scene with satisfaction. He'd spent a decade working toward this moment. He'd manipulated France into declaring war, unified the German states through shared victory, and crowned a German emperor in the palace of Louis XIV. It was a masterpiece of political theater, but he also understood what he'd created, a permanent enemy. France would never forgive this. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine, the capture of Napoleon III, the siege of Paris, those were military defeats. They stung, but nations recovered from military defeats. This was different. This was humiliation embedded in stone and ceremony. This was a wound that would fester. 48 years later, Bismarck's prediction would come true. French and German soldiers would slaughter each other by the millions in trenches stretching from Switzerland to the sea. And when that war ended, France would demand its revenge in this very room. On May 10, 1871, the Treaty of Frankfurt was signed. France ceded Alsace and most of Lorraine to Germany, over 5,000 square miles of territory, including the cities of Strasbourg and Metz. The population of these provinces, over 1.5 million people, became German subjects overnight. Most considered themselves French. They had no say in the matter. France was also required to pay an indemnity of 5 billion francs, an enormous sum, roughly equivalent to 20% of France's annual national income. The payment would be made in installments over 3 years. Until the debt was paid in full, German troops would occupy parts of northeastern France. The treaty was signed under protest. France had no choice. The alternative was a resumption of the war, and France had no army left to fight it. The war was over. France had lost 150,000 soldiers killed, along with tens of thousands of civilians. Disease, starvation, and exposure had claimed countless more. The professional military had been destroyed. 2 provinces were gone. The treasury was bankrupt. The nation was divided and bitter. Germany had emerged as the dominant power on the continent, possessing the largest army in Europe, a unified government, and the industrial resources of Alsace added to its own. But the war with Germany was over. The war within France was just beginning. By March 1871, Paris had been through hell. 4 months of siege, starvation, bombardment, and humiliation. The city had surrendered. German troops had marched through the Arc de Triomphe. The empire had fallen, a harsh peace treaty had been signed, and now the national government, dominated by conservative monarchists elected in February, was based at Versailles, not Paris. The Parisians saw this as a betrayal. They'd starved while the provinces had food. They'd fought while the government negotiated. They'd lost sons and fathers defending the Republic. And now men who'd opposed the Republic were running the country. Worse, the government made a series of catastrophic decisions. In early March, the National Assembly voted to end the moratorium on debts and rents. Thousands of Parisians who'd survived the siege on credit now faced immediate financial ruin. Small businesses collapsed overnight. Families were evicted. Then the government cut off pay to the National Guard, the militia that had defended Paris and was now the only source of income for tens of thousands of men. Then, on March 18th, the government sent troops into Paris to seize cannons that the National Guard had purchased with public donations during the siege. It was a match to a powder keg. National Guard units in the working-class neighborhoods of Montmartre and Belleville refused to surrender the guns. Crowds gathered. Government troops, exhausted and unwilling to fire on fellow Frenchmen, fraternized with the militia instead of fighting them. 2 generals, Lecomte and Thomas, were seized by the crowd, dragged into a courtyard, and shot. By nightfall, the government had lost control of Paris. On March 28, 1871, the Paris Commune was proclaimed. It was a radical revolutionary government, socialist, anti-clerical, dominated by workers, intellectuals, and hardline Republicans. The Commune declared that Paris would govern itself. It rejected the authority of the national government. It vowed to continue the fight for a true republic. For 2 months, Paris became an experiment in revolutionary governance. The Commune separated church and state, abolished night work in bakeries, established workers' cooperatives, declared that abandoned workshops could be taken over by employees. It was chaotic, idealistic, and completely unworkable in the long term. But it terrified the conservative government at Versailles and the European elites watching from abroad. The government decided to crush it. In April, government forces under Marshal MacMahon, the same MacMahon defeated at Worth, began assembling outside Paris. Troops were brought back from German-occupied zones. Artillery was positioned. Plans were made for a full assault on the capital. The Commune prepared defenses. Barricades went up across the city, hundreds of them, built from cobblestones, overturned wagons, sandbags, furniture. National Guard units took positions. Some women formed their own battalions. The Commune declared it would fight to the death. On May 21st, government troops entered Paris through an undefended gate. What followed was a week of urban warfare, more brutal than anything the siege had produced. Government forces fought street by street, block by block, barricade by barricade. Artillery blasted holes in buildings. Infantry stormed through the rubble. Anyone caught with a weapon was shot on sight. Many who weren't armed were shot anyway, accused of being communards based on their appearance or neighborhood. The communards fought back with desperate ferocity. They set fires to slow the government's advance. Buildings, warehouses, even public monuments. The Tuileries Palace, residence of Napoleon III, was burned to the ground. The Hôtel de Ville was torched. Flames consumed entire blocks. The communards also executed hostages, priests, police officers, political opponents. The Archbishop of Paris, Georges Darboy, was shot along with dozens of others. But the government's reprisals were worse by orders of magnitude. As government troops advanced, they shot prisoners without trial. Men, women, and teenagers were lined up against walls and executed by firing squad. Bodies were left in the streets as warnings. The bloodiest fighting occurred in the eastern neighborhoods, Belleville and Ménilmontant, where working-class communards made their last stand. On May 28th, the final barricade fell. The week became known as La Semaine Sanglante, Bloody Week. Estimates of the dead vary wildly, but most historians place communard deaths between 10,000 and 20,000. Thousands more were arrested, tried by military tribunals, and either executed or deported to penal colonies in New Caledonia. Government forces lost around 1,000 men. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. The Paris Commune traumatized France for a generation. Socialists and Republicans saw it as martyrdom, proof that the ruling class would murder workers rather than allow reform. Conservatives saw it as vindication of their fears, proof that revolution led to chaos and bloodshed. The divide deepened. Trust between the classes evaporated. France, already humiliated by Germany, now added civil war to its list of wounds. But the largest wound, the one that wouldn't heal, was Alsace-Lorraine. The two provinces Germany annexed weren't empty land. They were home to over 1.5 million people. Most spoke French or a French-German dialect. Most considered themselves French. Their cities, Strasbourg and Metz, were culturally and economically French. Overnight, they became German. Residents were given a choice: accept German citizenship or leave. Tens of thousands left, abandoning homes, businesses, and land rather than live under German rule. Those who stayed found themselves second-class citizens in their own homeland, governed by Germans, taught in German schools, conscripted into the German army. In France, the loss became a national obsession. Textbooks taught children that Alsace-Lorraine had been stolen. Maps showed the provinces draped in black mourning. Monuments depicted the city of Strasbourg as a weeping woman. Politicians invoked the lost provinces in speeches. Revanche, revenge, became the rallying cry of French nationalism. For 44 years, the wound festered. And in August 1914, when war broke out again, the demand to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine was one of the driving forces behind French commitment to total war. The Franco-Prussian War didn't just reshape the map of Europe. It set the stage for the catastrophes of the 20th century. Germany emerged as the dominant continental power, but surrounded by resentful neighbors. France to the west seeking revenge, Russia to the east wary of German strength. Britain across the Channel concerned about the balance of power. Bismarck, for all his brilliance, had created a system that depended on his personal management. When he was dismissed in 1890, the carefully balanced alliances began to unravel. France allied with Russia, Britain moved closer to France, Germany felt encircled, arms races began, tensions escalated, and in 1914, a spark in the Balkans, exactly as Bismarck had predicted, ignited the powder keg. The First World War killed 10 million soldiers and reshaped Europe again. And when it ended in 1918, the victorious Allies chose the location for the peace treaty with deliberate symbolism. The Treaty of Versailles, ending World War I, was signed on June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors, the same room where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau insisted on it. He'd been a young journalist during the Franco-Prussian War. He'd witnessed the siege of Paris. He remembered the humiliation of 1871. And now, 48 years later, he watched German delegates forced to sign a treaty that stripped Germany of territory, imposed crushing reparations, and assigned sole blame for the war. It was France's revenge, served cold in the same hall where France had been humiliated. And it set the stage for the next war, because the Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany just as the Treaty of Frankfurt had humiliated France. It created resentment, bitterness, and a desire for revenge that a young Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler would exploit 20 years later. The Hall of Mirrors witnessed the proclamation of the German Empire in 1871. It witnessed Germany's humiliation in 1919. And the consequences of both ceremonies led to World War II, the Holocaust, and the near destruction of European civilization. Victory and defeat aren't endpoints. They're turns in a cycle. The young Prussian officer who cheered in the Hall of Mirrors in 1871 couldn't imagine that his grandson would starve in the ruins of Berlin in 1945. The French soldiers who survived the siege of Paris couldn't imagine their grandsons dying in trenches at Verdun and the Somme. History doesn't move in straight lines, it circles back. Humiliation breeds revenge. Revenge breeds humiliation. And the wheel keeps turning, grinding lives beneath it. If there's a lesson from 1870, it's this. Wars don't end when the shooting stops. They echo through generations, shaping the future in ways the victors never anticipate and the defeated never forget. The Franco-Prussian War was 6 months of fighting, but its consequences lasted 75 years and cost tens of millions of lives. And it all started with an edited telegram and a sick emperor trapped in a valley with nowhere to run. September 1st, 1870, a French emperor surrenders his sword in a valley surrounded by German guns. January 18th, 1871. A German emperor is crowned in a French palace. 6 months, 2 moments, and the world changed. This wasn't just a war between France and Germany. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another. The old way of war, professional armies fighting limited campaigns for limited objectives, was over. What replaced it was something new and terrifying. Industrial warfare. Railroads moving hundreds of thousands of troops. Telegraph networks coordinating attacks across hundreds of kilometers. Mass conscription turning entire populations into soldiers. Artillery that could destroy cities from miles away. Prussia didn't just defeat France, it demonstrated that the future of war would be faster, larger, and more lethal than anything Europe had seen before. And Europe learned the wrong lessons. Germany learned that rapid mobilization and overwhelming force could crush enemies before they organized. France learned that defeat demanded revenge. Russia, Austria, and Britain watched and began preparing for the next war. Building bigger armies, forging new alliances, stockpiling weapons. The arms race that led to 1914 started in 1871. But the deeper tragedy is how predictable it all was. Bismarck knew. In his later years, he warned that the German Empire he'd created was surrounded by enemies, and that one day a crisis, probably in the Balkans, would drag Europe into a war that would destroy everything. He died in 1898, 16 years before his prediction came true. The men who fought at Sedan and Gravelotte believed they were securing peace through victory. Their grandsons died at Verdun, the Somme, and Passchendaele, fighting the same enemy in a war even more catastrophic. The men who celebrated in the Hall of Mirrors in 1871 believed they were building an empire that would last centuries. 74 years later, that empire lay in ruins, its cities bombed to rubble, its people starving, its territory occupied. Victory is not permanent. Defeat is not final. Both are just moments in a cycle that repeats because we refuse to learn. France humiliated Germany in the Napoleonic Wars. Germany humiliated France in 1871. France humiliated Germany in 1919. Germany tried to dominate Europe again in 1939, and millions died each time the wheel turned. The numbers are overwhelming. 150,000 French dead in 1870, 10 million dead in World War I, 60 million dead in World War II. But numbers don't convey the reality. The reality is a mother in Paris feeding her children rat meat and watching them grow thinner every day. The reality is a Prussian soldier at Sedan, loading shells into a gun, hands blistered and bleeding, wondering if his brother survived the infantry assault. The reality is a French officer at Gravelotte dying in a wheat field, his last thought not of glory or France, but of his daughter who won't remember his face. The reality is a German soldier in 1916, grandson of a man who fought at Worth, drowning in mud at Verdun, and realizing his grandfather's victory meant nothing. These are the costs that treaties don't mention and victory parades don't acknowledge. And here's the part that should make us pause. We haven't stopped. The tools have changed. We don't use Krupp guns and cavalry charges anymore. Now it's drones and precision missiles and nuclear weapons. But the cycle remains the same. Nations still pursue dominance. Leaders still risk war for power and prestige. Humiliation still breeds revenge. The Franco-Prussian War matters because it's not just history. It's a warning. It shows what happens when nations believe their own propaganda, when they assume wars will be short and decisive, when they humiliate their enemies and expect no consequences, when they build empires on resentment and call it peace. It shows that the costs of war don't end when the shooting stops. They compound through generations, poisoning the future, ensuring the cycle repeats. And it shows that the individuals caught in these cycles, the soldiers, the civilians, the children who grow up in the aftermath, deserve better than to be footnotes in someone else's ambition. The Hall of Mirrors still stands in Versailles. Tourists visit every day, photographing the chandeliers and the painted ceilings, marveling at the beauty. Most don't know what happened there. Most don't know that the room witnessed both the birth of the German Empire and its humiliation 48 years later. Most don't know that both events set the stage for wars that killed millions. But now, as you drift towards sleep, you know. You know the story of an emperor trapped in a valley, of a war that began with pride and ended with starvation, of victories that became defeats and defeats that became victories, all turning in an endless circle. You know that the consequences of those 6 months in 1870 echoed through 75 years of history, and perhaps in knowing we can hope to break the cycle, or at least understand it better. Rest now and let the story settle into your thoughts like autumn leaves falling on forgotten battlefields, covering the past but never quite erasing it. The dawn will come again, as it always does, over valleys both peaceful and troubled, and we can only hope we learn from those who came before us. Good night.